This video will analyse the skill acquisition process that I have adopted in learning to do a straddle press to handstand, a gymnastic skill. This skill involves the learner starting in a straddle hold position, supporting their body weight through their hands. Their shoulders then begin to shift forwards as they lift their hips up vertically over their shoulders and legs come together in the handstand position. This is followed by a controlled descent back into a straddle hold, better exemplified by the second gymnast in this video. Throughout the skill, the performer adjusts their centre of mass by contribution of joint torques at the wrists, shoulders and hips. This skill appealed to me as a gymnast myself of 9 years and now as a coach who better understands the biomechanics of more complex skills. In the dynamical systems theory, the learner is viewed as a dynamic, complex system in which searches for functional states of coordination known as attractor states. Attractors are adopted as the most stable patterns of behaviour for the individual with regards to the current constraints they must satisfy, classified as either organismic, task or environmental. As expressed by Davids et al., the interaction of constraints on the neuromuscular system of the learner results in the emergence of more developed states of coordination that may be optimised through practice. This concept is well represented by this diagram, in which the very top curves represent novice behaviour and the larger bottom curves reflect expert behaviour. As the learner continues to practice, they will deepen and widen these attractor wells, respectively representing more stable attractors and a greater repertoire of movement patterns available to them. Nevertheless, skill acquisition is a non-linear process, as consistent practice is rarely reflected by consistent increments in skill improvements. In fact, the transition from one attractor state to another commonly involves a period of destabilization known as phase transition. Throughout this video, the increased stability of coordination patterns developed will be demonstrated via the application of transfer tests, which success highlights my ability to satisfy various constraints in accordance with my broadening perceptual motor landscape. Learners who develop a greater repertoire of movement attractors are more adaptive to any performance environment and are better able to self-organize. This notion is of vital importance to this particular skill, as the SPH and handstand itself are core elements in gymnastics that form the basis of many skills, such as the caster handstand, the stolder on bars, or it may also be performed as a beam mount. From a traditional theory point of view, Schmidt's schema theory notes that skills of a similar nature as such are considered to be governed by a general motor program that contains information needed to perform a class of movements. This justifies the transferability of this skill from one context to another with greater ease or with less practice within the new context. A well-established concept of skill acquisition is that dedicating 20 hours of focused effort towards learning a skill will enable the learner to become reasonably good by developing approximate movement solutions to the task. Therefore, for the purpose of this assessment, I have dedicated 20 hours over 40 days to learning the SPH. As a physically demanding skill, training sessions will be limited to 30 minutes a day to reduce the effects of fatigue and organismic constraint, which may otherwise lead to poorer performances. It is anticipated at the end of 40 days I will not have achieved this skill. However, I will have made some significant skill improvement. The current training program was developed as a fusion of various sources of information, including scientific articles, resources from Gymnastics Australia, videos of both novices and experts performing the skill, as well as lecture material from this subject that would ultimately shape the way I pieced it all together. Most importantly, I drew upon my own experience as a coach and athlete to determine the most applicable methods and drills specific to me as the learner. Notably, the training program was developed with the CLA as its cornerstone, as I sought to manipulate organismic, environmental, and especially task constraints to create a favourable context for skill acquisition to occur. Here is my extended training program. Activities were generally planned on a daily basis, as I was not able to predict my rate of progression, considering the non-linear nature of skill acquisition. Therefore, Transitioning to more difficult skills was reliant on performance in transfer tests. These included the straddle hold on beam, handstand hold on the floor, handstand hold on the beam, drag ups in a row against the couch. These were largely adapted from strength testing protocols developed by Gymnastics Australia for the purpose of tracking athlete progress. Improved balance as a result of underlying mechanisms, including the use of vestibular, visual and proprioceptive information, increased muscular strength in the wrist extensors, shoulder flexors, trunk flexors, hip flexors and abductors amongst others. This will be developed via the following skill-specific exercises: wrist strengthening, TheraBand shoulder flexion, straddle V-snaps, push-ups, leg pulses, Swiss ball shoulder rocks, and glute space exercises. Increased range of motion in the hips, shoulders, and wrists via the following exercises. Hip flexibility will be developed with caution, as I have had a minor labrum tear in the past, and sitting in splits can cause some discomfort. A further limiting organismic constraint related to my structural anatomy is my scoliosis and lordosis. Essentially, the rotation and lateral shift of my upper body and the anterior pelvic tilt of my lower body makes it difficult to achieve what traditional gymnastics coaches would consider to be a perfectly straight handstand. This is highlighted by the CLA principle, which states, learning will be more difficult when the intrinsic dynamics of a learner do not match the task dynamics. Nevertheless, the CLA asserts that the ideal model does not exist. For this reason, the emphasis of my program is to encourage adaptability rather than to focus on achieving an idealized pattern or behavior. During practice sessions, the surfaces and heights upon which the skills were performed varied, including carpet, tiles, grass, pool water, and on a beam. Although this was not a constraint that was manipulated, the weather, for example temperature and humidity, also has an effect on performance, as does gravity. Task constraints. In order to reduce the physical demand of the skill, both part task and adaptive training methods were utilised to break down complex tasks into more manageable components. Part task training involves practicing a subset of skill components as a precursor to the performance of the whole skill. Adaptive training involves progressively increasing the difficulty of a task as performance improves. Based on the DST and Bernstein's degrees of freedom, I have deconstructed this skill into the following components. Straddle hold variations: tuck hold on beam, straddle on beam, on floor, and with ankle weights. Handstand variations: against the wall, with different hand positions, with reduced space of support, with altered cognitive demand, with different entries and handstand walking. Pike up to address strength of the shoulder girdle and trunk. On the reformer chair, in the pool, on a bench, and on the Swiss ball. Straddle jump to handstand, against the wall and couch, on the floor and with straight legs, and on the beam, as well as straddle drag ups against the wall and couch, and on the floor unassisted. Hold practice on the ground with a connecting straddle jump, in the pool, with TheraBands and my dad pulling my hips attached to a rope, and on a beam. Hold practice attempts were integrated early in the program in an effort to maintain the perception-action coupling requirements of the skill, which is often disrupted when coaches opt for part practice. Specifically, by adding in the downwards phase of the skill, I would also be developing my ability to use visual and proprioceptive information as I increase hip flexion to clear my feet as I approach the ground. a successful application of the CLA, and there is significant evidence of my skill progress. Here are my transfer test results. Straddle hold on beam, drag ups in a row against the couch. Via less objective measures, my handstand technique improved. That is, the movement patterns I adopted under the influence of various constraints. Attractor states underwent a process of destabilization as new attractors emerged, in which enabled me to hold longer handstands as I was better able to cope with perturbances. Furthermore, while I was not able to successfully perform the skill in hold practice independently, I was able to achieve it under manipulated task constraints in which alleviated the resistance of my own body weight. This was one of my first videos, and this was one of my final videos. If we analyse the degrees of the shoulder flexion, this is visibly improved. My eccentric control has also improved considerably. It was slower, and I was able to complete the final straddle hold, both on the floor and impressively on the beam. Evidently, the results gathered are highly reflective of the DST and CLA background theories established earlier, and of the methodology that was followed throughout. Specifically, the CLA highlights that through the manipulation of organismic task and environmental constraints, the learner develops functional movement solutions that will help satisfy these specific constraints. In my program, I adopted a vast array of exercises with varying constraints to allow me to develop stable coordinated patterns. Although some of these methods I adopted may have seemed unconventional, this was my way of exploring my perceptual motor landscape relative to my environment. I did not simply alter constraints for the sake of it. However, each task constraint had a purpose and a targeted behaviour to elicit. Evidence of my progress suggests this process was successful and thus can be considered a strength. Furthermore, unlike traditional gymnastics training, I did not have a coach telling me the specifics of how to perform the skill. I did, however, take countless videos of myself throughout training in order to analyse my behaviour and identify ways I could improve it. By doing so, I determined the nature and frequency of presented augmented information in a way that was useful to me as the learner. Firstly, whilst the program was initially planned to be 40 days straight, it was extended to 50 days. My schedule did not take into account the need for rest days, considering the demanding nature of the skill. Rather, I had incidentally taken days off where I was too busy or too lazy to complete a session. Proper use of periodization could have improved the quality of my sessions. Similarly, I did not pre-plan my session times as my weekly schedule was unpredictable. However, organising a time for the next day at least would have been useful so that I could knowingly fit it in my schedule, rather than pushing training back till the end of the day. Some of my sessions were completed at 9 p.m. This would have impacted my levels of fatigue and overall skill performance. Furthermore, while skill practice was enjoyable for me, I was unmotivated and inconsistent when it came to resistance training aspects of the program. For example, I avoided activities such as push-ups, or if I did them, I did the bare minimum of reps and sets. Essentially, strength improvements could have been optimized by developing a more structured strength and conditioning program. Overall, there is great potential to apply the CLA and a hands-off approach to coaching within a gymnastics training context. This approach would involve coaches designing an environment that allows the gymnast to explore their perceptual motor landscape rather than being told explicitly what to do and using the correct technique. While this program could be replicated, as highlighted by Ustinov 2008, what works for one gymnast may or may not work for another. Therefore, coaches who know a broad range of progressions are better equipped to address the individual dynamics of learners. Overall, successful skill acquisition occurred, however, in a non-linear fashion as performance fluctuated from day to day, as I adapted to current constraints. I practiced skills in a wide array of contexts, for example, on different surfaces using altered hand positions at different heights and both in noisy and quiet conditions. I practiced most skills independently, but for some I required assistance. Much of my program involved performing skills using part practice, but I also embedded whole practice attempts very early on. By using a wide variety of contexts, more stable attractors developed as old ones phased out due to self-organisation. While there was some level of motor skill retention, certain organismic constraints limited skill performance, as they did not entirely align with the task dynamics. Although there is a long way to go, with continued application of the CLA, I may develop myoorganismic constraints and movement attractors to better satisfy the task constraints and hopefully achieve the straddle press to handstand.